spectrum. We'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, about the recent white spaces proceeding, which reallocated a good portion of the broadcast spectrum for wireless uses. Universal service, which I know Jennifer will talk a great deal about and certainly has been in the trenches. Universal service is our economic system for essentially subsidizing what is called universal service. In the old days, that was telephone service, plain old copper wire telephone service. And so the notion is we needed a subsidy program so that we would be able to give money to carriers who were building out the network. Obviously, we know today that we all have telephone service, and so clearly what needs to be reformed is to look at broadband as a separate aspect of universal service and to reform that subsidy program so that the money flows not just to copper wire, but to any type of technology that is facilitating broadband. There's a lot of reconciliation, obviously, that has to be done between the existing legal regime and regulations and standards and policies and incentives, all the things that government does. And clearly, the FCC in the short term and in the long term will be looking at these, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the rulemakings. I lost track of the number, but I think we're north of about 60 rulemakings that the FCC is projected to do. There are about 200 recommendations in the National Broadband Plan. And so presumably at some point, all of those recommendations will be dealt with in one way or the other. It doesn't mean that they will all be dealt with by the FCC, nor will they be dealt with in a regulatory way, but a number of them will. Let's look at the long-term goals, and this is called the 100 Squared program, which received a lot of attention and publicity when the National Broadband Plan was launched. The idea is to take 100 million US households, which is about what our population is today, and within 10 years, make sure that they have access to broadband download speeds of at least 100 megabits per second and actual upload speeds of at least 50 megabits per second. To give you a perspective, the current average in the United States is about 4 megabits. So it's basically increasing the speed by about 25 times and obviously expanding the penetration so it will reach the vast majority of American homes. The second is this leadership role. We lost the lead, particularly in a technology called GSM in the wireless area. I think a lot of people would say we lost the lead in terms of having a lot of mobile innovation not take place in the United States. A lot of it has taken place in Asia and Europe. And so from a leadership standpoint, I think long-term the United States is interested in reclaiming the title of world's greatest country for mobile innovation. And so wants to clearly have the United States as the laboratory for mobile applications and developments. And that's a very important long-term goal. And then this notion of affordable access, the aspect of people not just having access, but also being able to pay for it and wanting to keep it over time. There's something called churn, which is the notion that you sign up for broadband, or you sign up for cable, and then a few months later you decide that you're not going to pay for it anymore, you don't want it anymore. And that means people drop off of the adoption map. So there's a lot of critical thinking now in terms of what it takes to keep people on broadband. And part of it is how it affects their daily lives. And a lot of what affects their daily lives is how it enables them to go out into the workforce. We're going to have a panel this afternoon dealing with digital workforce issues. But there is a connection with adoption and how people use broadband, and that's really what the third goal is looking at.
Will really help if they can really only do it on a going forward basis, or if they figure out a way to otherwise consent carriers. So, for example, one of the bands recently, the Commission allowed for more flexibility for mobile networks to be deployed in the band that hadn't previously existed, and in exchange for that, it required the carriers to build out earlier than they'd otherwise anticipated. So this is something I think the Commission really needs to, it was not covered in the plan well. The Commission said that they thought maybe, encouraging more secondary markets transactions could happen through lower filing fees. That is not the answer. The filing fees are a couple $100s for an application, so that's not it. It's performance benchmarks. And I think that is a trend that we're seeing at the commission, and I think we will be seeing more of that.
You know, when they say it's not about the money, it's the money. And to roll out the national broadband plan, and I don't know about the commission, with all the different rulemakings and content, and the content of the plan itself, it's going to cost an enormous sum of dollars. And the questions are, you know, where's that money going to come from? Is it private sector, public sector? And looking at the future, do we see new technologies emerging from this process? What's around the corner? What can we be enjoying this time, next decade?
Do you want to do the funding, or do you want me to?
I think Jennifer is one of the great experts in LTE, so I will certainly defer to Jennifer, and then I'll come back to comment.
Okay, well, I'll address some of the funding issue first. So what the plan says is that in order to close the gap for the 14 million Americans that don't have access to adequate broadband today, it will take roughly $24 billion. Where's that money going to come from? It's probably a mix of government funding and private enterprise deciding that broadband's a good bet and they can make money at it, and so they'll invest their own dollars. Of the 24 billion, about 15 billion will be coming from reallocating money within the Universal Service Fund. So they're looking to take money away from what they call the high cost program and reallocating it for something they call the Connect America Fund. So it will be funding broadband connections. They're also looking to take some of that money and to create a broadband mobility fund. And I think actually the commission is taking that up today. I think the rulemaking will be starting today at the commission meeting. What the plan said was that would be $4 billion for the mobility fund. I hear that the rulemaking is going to just propose an initial $300 million. So I'll be real curious to see how that rulemaking comes out today. So there is the reallocation of money within the Universal Service Fund, and then there's also a call to action to Congress to try to allocate more money for different broadband initiatives. So Stuart mentioned earlier, perhaps more money for a public safety network. The plan talks about more money for Indian health care, more money for tribal broadband developments. So, you know, there is sort of a handout to Congress to say, you know, please give us some more money for some of these discrete kinds of deployments. There was also a proposal for the Community Connect Fund, which is operated through USDA. It's a small program, $13.9 million, but hundreds of millions of dollars of requests have been made, and that's for the purpose of, you know, creating a broadband center in areas that don't have good broadband, and then providing subsidized service for some time in order to encourage broadband adoption. So there's some, you know, combination of different initiatives to assist with the funding.
Yeah, I made a comment that a couple of years ago, the Digital Policy Institute had recommended to Congress that we have a recasting of the Universal Service Fund to do exactly what's being proposed right now. Stuart, what are your comments?
Well, there's a parallel universe that's going on, and it relates to money, but in the stimulus law, $7.2 billion were allocated through two different programs, one administered by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration and the Department of Commerce, called Broadband Technologies Opportunity Program, BTOP, and then the so-called BIP program, which is the Broadband Innovation Program, which is administered by the Rural Utility Service and the Department of Agriculture. So we have money that essentially has gone out the door already as part of the stimulus law, and all of that money had to be essentially committed by September 30th of this year, which means a few weeks ago. There are literally hundreds of broadband test beds, if you will, around the country, which are the beneficiaries of that. A number of these are anchor institutions, and so when I talked about hospitals and schools and libraries, many of those in areas both rural and urban will now be able to upgrade their infrastructure. In terms of technology development, I think we will also probably see some interesting applications, perhaps some new research and development coming out of this $7.2 billion, and to some extent that might make the rest of the money more efficient, because if you know how it works in practice, you may have a better idea how to develop future budgets around that. each of the grantees in both of those programs need to complete their projects within 2 years. And so that gets back to what Jennifer spoke about before, which seems like a relatively common sense thing, but the government doesn't usually do, which is establish deadlines. And so now in these funding programs, essentially, you need to complete your project in order to get all your funding. And so that creates an enormous incentive for these operations, these projects to be completed. And I think we'll have a very interesting real-time laboratory in the United States looking at these broadband projects, trying to figure out how successful or unsuccessful they are, and then hopefully feeding all of that back into this organic process, this document called the National Broadband Plan. And hopefully that will then help us adjust some of the numbers and may also introduce some other technologies that we haven't been thinking about.
You know, Stuart mentioned the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. You should know about this organization because he helped found it during one of his former lives in Washington some years ago. And it serves as the president's spokes agency on communications matters. It's housed in the Department of Commerce. Jennifer, Stuart talked a little bit about new technologies, things around the corner. What kind of whiz-bang stuff do we expect to see in the future?
Well, there's a whole chapter in the National Broadband Plan about research and development, and